December 14, 1941. The second sector of defense, Sevastopol, Crimea. The air inside the limestone fissure tastes of sulfur and wet chalk. It is a dead silence, the kind that only exists in the brief, terrifying pauses between artillery barrages. 60 feet away, through a gap in the skeletal remains of a vineyard wall, a splash of field-gray uniform moves against the white snow. Lyudmila Pavlichenko does not breathe. Her heart rate, conditioned by months of adrenaline and exhaustion, beats in a slow, rhythmic thud that she can feel in her fingertips. She is 25 years old, but looking at her now, encased in an oversized, mud-caked camouflage smock, her face smeared with grease and dirt, you would think she is a creature born of this earth, ancient and lethal. She presses her cheek against the freezing wooden stock of her Mosin-Nagant 1891-30. The scope, a 4-power PE optical sight, is her entire world. Through the glass, the war is not a chaotic mess of noise and fear. It is math problem, windage, elevation, lead. The German officer steps out. He is confident, too confident. He believes the mortar barrage 10 minutes ago cleared this ridge. He raises his binoculars, scanning the tree line for the Russian bandits his commanders scream about. He is looking for a soldier. He is looking for a man. He never suspects that the angel of death watching him is a former history student with a thesis on Bohdan Khmelnytsky. Lyudmila exhales. The vapor of her breath is the only movement in the bush. She squeezes the trigger. The rifle kicks against her bruised shoulder. The crack is sharp, swallowed almost instantly by the winter wind. Through the scope, she sees the officer's head snap back. He collapses, his binoculars tumbling into the mud. Panic erupts in the German line. A second soldier rushes to grab the officer's arms, to drag him to cover. Clack, clack, she works the bolt. A fresh 7.6 Tum cartridge slides into the chamber. She doesn't hate the second man. She doesn't know him, but he is a silhouette in her scope, an invader on her land. Crack. The second soldier falls across the first. 2 shots, 2 bodies. Lyudmila doesn't wait to admire her work. In the sniper's trade, vanity is a death sentence. She stays motionless for 10 minutes, waiting for the retaliatory machine gun fire to rake the bushes above her head. When it comes, shredding the leaves she was using for cover, she is already gone, belly crawling through a shallow drainage ditch 50 yards away, disappearing into the ruins of Sevastopol like a ghost. To understand how a scholar became a predator, we have to rewind. We have to leave the blood-soaked snow of the Crimea and go back to a library in Kiev, under the warm sun of a different world. June 22, 1941, Kiev State University. The loudspeakers crackled to life across the Soviet Union at noon. It wasn't music. It was the voice of Vyacheslav Molotov, the Minister of Foreign Affairs. His voice was trembling. Citizens and citizenesses of the Soviet Union. Today, at 4 o'clock in the morning, without any claims having been presented to the Soviet Union, without a declaration of war, German troops attacked our country. Operation Barbarossa had begun. 3 million Axis troops were pouring across the border. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was in her 4th year of history studies. She was bright, opinionated, and fiercely independent. She was the kind of woman who, when boys at a factory job boasted about their shooting scores, went to a paramilitary training club just to prove she could beat them. And she did. She earned the Voroshilov Sharpshooter Badge, a prestigious marksmanship award, not because she wanted to kill, but because she hated to lose. But looking at the radio that day, the history books on her desk suddenly seemed like heavy, useless paper. The next morning, she stood in line at the recruiting office. The line wound around the block, young men with fire in their eyes. Old veterans of the Civil War and Lyudmila. She was wearing her best dress, her hair neatly combed, her fingernails manicured. When she finally reached the desk, the recruitment officer, a tired man with dark circles under his eyes, didn't even look up. Name: Lyudmila Pavlichenko. He glanced up then. He saw a girl, a student. He saw someone who should be rolling bandages, not holding a rifle. Nurse, he grunted, hovering his pen over the medical auxiliary column. No, Lyudmila said, her voice hard. Infantry, I want to carry a rifle. The officer laughed. It was a dry, dismissive sound. Look, girl, the front isn't a shooting gallery, it's blood and guts. You want to help? Go to the hospital, we need nurses. I am a Voroshilov's sharpshooter, she insisted, slapping her certificate onto the desk. I can shoot better than half the men in this line. He pushed the paper back to her. Next. She didn't leave, she refused to leave. For days, she badgered the office. Finally, desperate for bodies to throw in front of the German blitzkrieg, they relented. But they didn't give her a rifle, they gave her a shovel. She was assigned to the 25th Rifle Division, not as a sniper, but as standard infantry. When she arrived at the front lines near Odessa, the situation was catastrophic. The Red Army was reeling. Logistics had collapsed. There were more soldiers than weapons. "Where is my rifle?" she asked her sergeant. He pointed to the terrified boy in the foxhole next to her. "When he dies," the sergeant said grimly, "you take his." It was a brutal introduction to the reality of the Eastern Front. It wasn't glorious charges. It was digging trenches in hard earth while the Luftwaffe screamed overhead, turning the ground into a cratered hellscape. August 8, 1941, Belyaevka near Odessa. The moment of truth came on a scorched hill outside the port city of Odessa. The 25th Rifle Division was trying to hold back the Romanian army, Germany's ally, which was pressing hard on the southern flank. Lyudmila had finally acquired a rifle, a standard-issue Mosin-Nagant with iron sights. No scope, just a bolt and a barrel. Her commander, desperate to stop a Romanian advance, handed her the weapon. He wanted to see if the girl from Kiev was just talk. "You see them?" He pointed down the slope. Two Romanian soldiers were moving comfortably in the distance, setting up an observation post. They were perhaps 300 meters away, a difficult shot for a novice with iron sights. Lyudmila lay prone in the dirt. The smell of the earth was overpowering. Her hands shook slightly. This wasn't a paper target. These were men, they had mothers, they had lives. She remembered the news from the border. The burning villages, the execution of civilians. The shaking stopped. She aligned the front sight post with the rear notch. She focused on the gray figure on the left. She applied the pressure. Banged. The figure crumpled. The second soldier froze. Confused by the sudden drop of his comrade, that hesitation was his end. Banged. 2 shots, 2 kills. The commander lowered his binoculars, looking at the young history student with a newfound respect and a hint of fear. "Okay," he said quietly, "you're in." Those 2 kills didn't go into her official tally. They were considered her test. But in that moment, Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the student, died, and Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the hunter, was born. She was issued a rifle with a PE-4 power scope the next day. September 1941, the defense of Odessa. The battle for Odessa was a grinder. The city was besieged from land and blockaded from the sea. For 2.5 months, the defenders held out against overwhelming odds. Lyudmila spent her days in no man's land. She learned quickly that sniping was 1% shooting and 99% suffering. She would wake up at 3:00 a.m., crawl out into the darkness and find a position, a hollowed-out tree stump, a bomb crater, a pile of rubble. And then she would wait. Sometimes she lay motionless for 18 hours. She couldn't move to eat. She couldn't move to relieve herself. If she shifted, the sun might glint off her scope. If she moved, a German spotter might see the sway of the grass. The sun beat down on her back. Flies crawled over her face, drinking the sweat and grime. She learned to slow her breathing, to enter a trance-like state where only the sector in front of her existed. Her tally began to rise, 10, 20, 50. She targeted officers first. Kill the brain and the body falters. Then the signalmen. Then the dog handlers. She became a priority target for the enemy. They mortared entire grid squares just because they suspected she was there. One afternoon in late September, the wind was howling across the steppe, kicking up dust that obscured the battlefield. Lyudmila was watching a German trench line. She saw a helmet rise. Most soldiers would have fired. Lyudmila waited. The helmet moved too rhythmically. It's a puppet. She realized they are baiting me. She scanned the area to the left of the helmet. There, a slight disturbance in the brush, a glint of glass. A German sniper was waiting for her to shoot the decoy so he could spot her muzzle flash. She adjusted her aim, ignoring the helmet and focusing on the bush 50 meters away from it. She visualized the man behind the scope. She estimated the windage. The gale would push the bullet 3 inches to the right. She aimed for the left edge of the bush. The rifle barked. A scream echoed across the field. The German sniper fell forward, half of his body tumbling out of his concealed foxhole. It was her first sniper duel. It would not be her last. By October, the situation in Odessa was untenable. The Germans had broken through into the Crimea, threatening to cut off the city entirely. The order came to evacuate. The Red Army would retreat by sea to the fortress city of Sevastopol. Lyudmila stood on the deck of the transport ship, watching the smoke rise from the city she had fought for. She had 187 confirmed kills to her name. She was tired. Her ears rang constantly from the concussions of artillery, and her shoulder was black and blue from the recoil of the Mosin-Nagant. She thought she had seen the worst of the war. She was wrong. Odessa was just the prologue. Sevastopol would be the main event. As the ship cut through the black waters of the Black Sea, heading toward the white cliffs of the Crimean Peninsula, Lyudmila cleaned her rifle. She oiled the bolt. She wiped the lens. She knew that where they were going, there would be no retreat. November 1941, the perimeter of Sevastopol. Sevastopol was not just a city. It was a fortress carved into rock. But by November, it was a prison. The German 11th Army, commanded by the brilliant and ruthless Erich von Manstein, had sealed the Crimean Peninsula. There was only the sea at their backs and a wall of German steel to their front. Lyudmila stepped off the transport and into a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon. The white limestone cliffs were scarred by heavy artillery. The city, once the jewel of the Black Sea, was being systematically dismantled by the Luftwaffe. She was no longer the girl from Kiev. She was a junior lieutenant. The soldiers whispered her name as she passed, Pavlichenko. The rumors said she didn't miss. They said she had ice water in her veins. But Lyudmila felt every kill. The weight of 187 lives sat in her chest like a stone. Yet she didn't stop. She couldn't. She was assigned to the 54th Rifle Regiment, tasked with holding the northern sector. It was here that she met Junior Lieutenant Leonid Kitsenko. Leonid was older, quiet, with eyes that had seen too much. He was a sniper, too. They were paired up. In the brutal mathematics of the sniper war, 1 + 1 equaled survival. 1 to shoot, 1 to spot, 1 to sleep, 1 to watch. They became a terrifying, devastating algorithm. They would leave the safety of the Soviet lines before dawn, creeping into the neutral zone, the deadly strip of land between the armies. They moved like lovers, perfectly in sync, communicating with hand signals and subtle nods. "Wind left to right 4 meters per second, Leonid would whisper, his eye glued to the spotting scope. "Range 600, moving target." Lyudmila would adjust, breathe, squeeze. "Crack." "Hit," Leonid would confirm, his voice flat. They fell in love in the shadow of death. It wasn't a romance of flowers and dates. It was a romance of shared warmth in a freezing foxhole, of sharing a tin of Spam while mortars walked closer to their position. He was her anchor. She was his shield. Together, their tally climbed into the hundreds. The Germans knew they were there. They began to broadcast messages over loudspeakers across the front lines. "Lyudmila Pavlichenko, come over to us. We will give you plenty of chocolate and make you a German officer." Lyudmila listened to the tinny voice echoing off the canyon walls and spat on the ground. "They think I can be bought for chocolate," she muttered to Leonid. "They don't know who they are fighting." When the bribes didn't work, the threats began. "If we catch you, we will tear you into 309 pieces," the loudspeakers screamed a few weeks later. They knew her count. The German intelligence was tracking her just as closely as the Soviet press. She had become a personal enemy of the Third Reich. March 1942, the duel. The Germans were done with loudspeakers. They sent a hunter. For 2 days, Soviet snipers in Lyudmila's sector had been dying. Clean headshots. No sound. The enemy was invisible, moving with a patience that matched Lyudmila's own. General Petrov, the commander of the coastal army, called for her. "There is a German ace out there," he said, pointing to a map of a contested ridge. "He's killed 3 of our best. He is hunting you, Lyudmila. Go get him." She went alone this time. She crawled into a position she had scouted days before, a hollow beneath a twisted root system of an oak tree. She covered herself with leaves and dust, and she waited. The first day passed, nothing. The sun baked the rocks, her muscles cramped, screaming in protest, but she remained statue, still. She urinated where she lay, refusing to break her cover. The second day, a glint of light on the opposite ridge. A trap or a mistake. She held her fire. The German was good. He was testing her. He wanted her to shoot at the glint so he could locate her muzzle flash. On the third morning, the exhaustion was hallucination grade. The rocks seemed to breathe. But Lyudmila's mind was clear. She knew he was there. Then she made a move. It was a gamble. She raised a mannequin, a small puppet dressed in a Soviet helmet on a stick, just an inch above the trench line to her right. Crack! The bullet tore through the helmet. The German thought he had her. He rose slightly from his position behind a sheet of corrugated metal to confirm the kill. He wanted to see the body. That was his mistake. He exposed the upper half of his face. Lyudmila was already locked on that metal sheet. She saw the movement. She didn't hesitate. The Mosin-Nagant kicked. She waited an hour before moving. When she finally crawled across the neutral zone under the cover of a mortar barrage, she found him. He was an older man, heavily decorated. In his pocket, she found a logbook. She opened it. The names and dates were neatly recorded. French soldiers from Dunkirk, British soldiers, and now dozens of Russian names. His tally was over 400. She looked at the dead man's face. He was a master of his craft, but he had made one assumption, that he was the predator. He never realized he was the prey. May 1942, the heartbreak. The war does not care about legends. It does not care about love. Lyudmila and Leonid were operating in a forward position, pinning down a German infantry advance. They were efficient, ruthless, stopping the attack cold. Then the mortars started. It wasn't a precision strike. It was a saturation bombing. The ground erupted around them. Dirt, shrapnel, and fire filled the air. "Move," Leonid shouted, grabbing her arm. They scrambled back toward the second line of defense. A shell landed 5 feet away. The concussion knocked the wind out of Lyudmila. Her ears rang with a high-pitched scream. She shook the dirt from her eyes and looked for Leonid. He was lying on the ground. He wasn't moving. She crawled to him, ignoring the shells falling like rain. She turned him over. The shrapnel had torn through his chest. He was gone. Lyudmila didn't scream. She didn't cry. Not then. A cold, black rage filled the space where her heart used to be. She grabbed his body. He was heavy, dead weight, but she lifted him. She dragged him through the mud, through the fire, all the way back to the Soviet lines. She would not leave him for the crows. After they buried him, something changed in Lyudmila. The math problem was gone. The duty was gone. Now it was purely personal. She went back to the front the next day. Her hands were steady, but her eyes were terrifying. She didn't just kill. She hunted with a vengeance that scared even her own commanders. In the weeks that followed, her kill count surged past 300. She took the most dangerous missions. She engaged entire squads. She was trying to kill the grief one bullet at a time. She was 25 years old. She was a widow of the war, and she was the deadliest woman on the planet. By June 1942, the end of Sevastopol was near. The Germans were bringing up Big Dora, a massive railway gun, to smash the city into dust. Lyudmila had 309 confirmed kills. The Soviet High Command realized something important. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was worth more alive as a symbol than dead in a trench. But the war wasn't done with her yet. One final mortar shell was waiting, one that would end her war not with a whimper but with a blast that would send her on a journey she never could have imagined, from the hell of Sevastopol to the White House. June 1942, Sector IV, Sevastopol Defense Line. The end of the siege came not with silence, but with a roar that shook the very bedrock of the Crimea. The German artillery, massed in unprecedented numbers, turned the city into a slaughterhouse. Lyudmila was crouched in a forward observation post when the world turned white. A mortar shell landed directly on the lip of her trench. The blast wave hit her like a physical blow, throwing her backward into the dirt wall. Shrapnel, razor-sharp fragments of hot steel, tore into her face and back. She didn't feel the pain immediately. She felt the wetness. Blood poured down her forehead, blinding her left eye. The noise of the battle faded into a dull, underwater thrum. She tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't obey. "Medic," someone screamed, or maybe she just thought it. They dragged her out, not a hero's exit, but a wounded soldier's retreat, hauled through the mud on a canvas stretcher while the sky rained fire. July 1942, the submarine. The fall of Sevastopol was inevitable. The Soviet High Command issued a ruthless order: evacuate the commanders, the wounded, and the valuable assets. Everyone else, nearly 90,000 soldiers and civilians, was left behind to fight to the death or surrender. Lyudmila, barely conscious, was loaded onto a submarine. The air inside was thick with the smell of diesel, sweat, and antiseptic. As the vessel submerged, slipping past the German naval blockade under the cover of darkness, Lyudmila wept. She wasn't crying from the pain of the shrapnel in her face. She was crying for the friends she was leaving on the shore. She was crying for Leonid, whose body lay somewhere in that burning city. She was crying because she had survived, and survival felt like a betrayal. Sevastopol fell days later. The survivors were marched into captivity. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was safe in the Caucasus, but a part of her died in Crimea. August 1942, the White House, Washington, D.C. 2 months later, Lyudmila stood in front of a mirror in the White House, adjusting the collar of her olive-drab uniform. The shrapnel scars on her face were still fresh, jagged pink lines against her pale skin. She had been pulled from the hospital bed and given a new mission. Stalin didn't need her rifle anymore. He needed her voice. The Soviet Union was bleeding to death. They needed the United States to open a second front in Europe to draw the Germans away from the East. So they sent the Lady Death. She walked into the East Room to meet President Franklin D. Roosevelt. But it was his wife, Eleanor, who stepped forward first. The First Lady looked at the young woman standing stiffly at attention. She saw the medals weighing down her tunic, the Order of Lenin, the endless combat ribbons. But mostly she saw the eyes. They were old eyes in a young face. "My dear," Eleanor said, softly breaking protocol to take Lyudmila's hand, "you look tired." It was the first time in a year someone had spoken to her as a human being, not a weapon. A friendship was born in that moment that would defy language barriers and Cold War politics. Eleanor invited Lyudmila to tour the country, to speak to the American people. September 1942, the press tour. But America in 1942 was a different planet. The reporters didn't know what to make of her. They saw a woman in a man's uniform. "Miss Pavlichenko," a reporter from the Washington Post asked, his pen poised, "in your country, are women allowed to wear makeup at the front?" Lyudmila blinked. "There is no rule against it," she said through her translator, her voice tight. "But who has time to think of her nose when a battle is going on?" "Is it true you wear silk underwear under your uniform?" another asked. "The uniform makes you look fat," a third commented. "Wouldn't you prefer a skirt?" Lyudmila's patience forged in. Hours of waiting for a target began to crack. She had killed 309 Nazis. She had crawled through mud mixed with human remains, and these men were asking about lipstick. "I wear my uniform with honor," she finally snapped at a press conference in New York. "It has the Order of Lenin on it. It has been covered in blood. It is plain to see that with American women, what is important is whether they wear silk underwear under their uniforms. What the uniform stands for, they have yet to learn. The headlines were vicious. They called her the girl sniper. They treated her like a circus act, but Lyudmila kept going. She had a mission. October 1942, Chicago, Illinois. The turning point came in Chicago. Thousands of people packed the auditorium. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and skepticism. Lyudmila stood at the podium. She looked out at the sea of faces, men in nice suits, women in pearls, people who had never heard the scream of a Stuka dive bomber. She put aside her prepared remarks. She leaned into the microphone. Her voice was steady, projecting the same lethal calm she used when lining up a shot. "Gentlemen," she said, her Russian echoing through the hall. The translator struggled to keep up with her intensity. "I am 25 years old, and I have killed 309 fascist invaders by now." The crowd went silent. The number hung in the air like a thunderclap. "Don't you think, gentlemen," she continued, her eyes scanning the room like a hunter scanning a tree line, "that you have been hiding behind my back for too long?" For a second, there was total silence. The men in the front row shifted uncomfortably. She had called them cowards to their faces. Then a roar erupted, not of anger but of realization. The crowd surged to its feet. They cheered, they wept. For the first time, they understood. This wasn't a girl. This was a soldier who had done the work they were too afraid to do. Her tour became a triumph. She returned to the Soviet Union a hero, having secured millions of dollars in donations and a shift in American public opinion. The second front would eventually open. Epilogue: the silence. Lyudmila Pavlichenko never returned to combat. She was too valuable to risk. She finished her education at Kiev University and became a historian. She married again. She had a son. She lived a quiet life in a small apartment in Moscow, but the war never really left her. Years later, in 1957, Eleanor Roosevelt visited Moscow during the height of the Cold War. The KGB watched her every move. They tried to keep her away from ordinary citizens. But Eleanor insisted on seeing her old friend. She went to Lyudmila's apartment. The two women, one a first lady, the other a lethal sniper, embraced. They sat in the small kitchen, away from the cameras and the spies, and talked for hours. Lyudmila Pavlichenko died on October 10, 1974. She was 58 years old. She is remembered as the most successful female sniper in history. But if you look at the photos of her from 1942, past the medals and the uniform, you see the truth. She was the girl who smiled at 309 Nazis. They never saw her, they never heard her, and because of her, they never took her home.